Upon taking a look at the inauguration chart for 2025, January 20th, 2025 at noon in Washington, I have to say that I see some really interesting patterns. But I also want to add that as an astrologer, the way you approach these kinds of charts is to ask yourself, if I say something about this date that correlates with something, then I should also be able to say similar things or draw logical conclusions from prior inauguration charts. And so I did that as well. I took a look at a number of these charts, going back in some cases to the 19th century, but especially in the post-FDR period, Franklin Roosevelt period, from then until now, because as it turns out, curiously, inauguration used to be in March. Up to that date, in the 1940s, the inauguration date was early March. So then, instead of having a really early sun in Aquarius, which is what we now have every single time there's an inauguration, back then it was around 13 degrees Pisces. And so the charts pivot around that sun position. And I looked for discernible patterns depending on what was happening in a given administration, including trying to get a sense of whether or not the administration would succeed. So I focused primarily on first terms, because the second term means after that, that particular president is replaced by another president. The idea being that if you're looking at a first term, can the chart tell you if that president will get a second term? And so, for example, Bill Clinton, elected in 92, he did get a second term, but Trump did not in 2017, or Biden in 2021. On the other hand, Obama also got a second term, and so did George W. Bush. So there's that, and there's also, can one spot patterns, themes, and indeed they're there. I was quite shocked to see, for example, the astrological symbolism in 2001 reflecting a terrorist attack and the country literally going to war. It's there. So now in the current chart, I would say most astrologers would agree that probably the most important feature is the Pluto conjunction to the sun. Though I'll add that all these charts, because of being January 20th charts, at noon, you'll always get Taurus rising, because the sun is elevated, Aquarius, is up there at the zenith, Capricorn is the midheaven, Aquarius is the zenith, and then you get Taurus rising. So this means Venus becomes really important in these charts, because Venus rules Taurus, and if you have planets, near the ascendant or descendant, become important as well. So if we talk about Pluto, then, it's pretty clear what is happening with this administration, Pluto conjunct the sun. Pluto is the urge to dominate and control. It's also a very masculine symbol. It's the higher octave of Mars. So this kind of behavior that we're seeing is Plutonian. And then to that, you can add plutocracy. Language can be incredibly illuminating. It's in our language. So plutocratic, oligarchic behavior is also a Pluto feature. You can go further and say this type of planet is incredibly transformative and changes things in radical ways. Although you have to be super careful, because then you would possibly project, okay, well, that means this crew This group of people is coming in and they're going to impose their way. This will be the change that the country will experience, and that'll be the end of that. I wouldn't go that far. The reason being that you can see in past patterns that something can start and then go in a different direction of change, not necessarily related to what the supposed initial impulse was, especially when it is this brazen. What we're seeing from the second Trump administration is quite brazen, and it's more unsavory, more illegal, more repugnant, definitely, than back in 2017. So the point being, which way is this going to go? There's where you look at the totality of the chart and you see, for example, that if you're looking for a success of the administration, will it continue in the next 4-year period? I noticed that you look at Obama's, for example, and he had a Jupiter-Sun conjunction at the time of his inauguration. He got a second term. You also see, it's really interesting in that chart, the healthcare struggle, because those houses are populated by planets opposing each other, squaring into the ninth. And so it's pretty clear that healthcare was a key aspect of that administration. Curiously, you also see it back in 92 during the first Clinton, the first 4 years when they tried, he and Hillary tried to implement healthcare, but it failed. But it's there. It's really clear. So you see that Jupiter next to the Sun in Obama's victory, and then he got a second term. Whereas in Trump's election in 16, what you see is a Saturn-Venus square. Remember what I said, the Venus is very important because it rules Taurus. So Venus, you qualify it practically equal to the Sun, or nearly so in charts like this. The Saturn square suggests a no, it's not going to work. And this is another administration where the health part of the chart is also heavily emphasized, although in this case, and this is why astrology can be slippier and you have to always calibrate it. Yes, they tried to take down Obamacare and were not successful in between 17 and 21, or between 16 and 20, but there was a pandemic. So it's reflected in that chart, right? And now when we look at 2021, if we want to know, well, what happened with Biden, because he didn't get a second term, or the Democrats didn't get a second term. What's interesting is Jupiter is once again in Aquarius, conjunct the Sun, but in between Jupiter and the Sun is Saturn. And that is what becomes a huge problem in terms of succeeding, as I understand it anyway, projecting into these charts. That would not be a good thing to have the Saturn in that position. And if we look at 2025, then the Pluto is there for sure. But what do we see? Saturn conjunct Venus in Pisces. That to me is at best really, really complicated for this Trump administration to bring about success in their projections. And in fact, typically with any administration, they try to extend into the next term. So if we make that their first objective, then that becomes a problem for sure. Now, the other thing is, this is where it gets a little spooky, and why you have to take into account not just one meaning of a planet. The planet encompasses a whole bunch of things, and Pluto as well as being, the plutocracy, the domination, the ultra male approach to everything. It's also a planet of great transformation and change, and it's the planet that rules the underworld. It's the planet of death. That's how in fact it works. Pluto's best way to change something short of literally killing you if you are really old and sick or some other reason. The reason I say this is that Pluto in one's lifetime can be the most useful planet toward transforming something from one state to another. But what happens is the transformation is deep enough that you can really see that the old self has been radically left behind, and a new self, a new situation appears. Nevertheless, though, in stark terms, it rules the topic, it rules death. And when we look at, for example, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, that's what actually happened in that period. In 1945, he wins his fourth term, and he lasted less than 3 months. I think it was maybe 40 something days, and he passed away. And now we have, lots of Pluto on the scene once again. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on that.